It's the end, but the moment wasn't prepared for. On today's Plays the Thing. Hi, I'm Aldo. Welcome to Plays the Thing. Today we're diving back into ShadowDark, the dark fantasy RPG written and designed by Kelsey Dione and published through her company Arcane Library. More specifically, we're continuing with our Gloaming campaign, which is set in the world that Kelsey introduced in her zine, Cursed Scroll number 1. Well, this is it, the story of how our Gloaming campaign ended. This is a long one, so I've decided to break it up into 3 parts. This video's focus, how we hit a brick wall during our final session and how I handled that momentary setback. Before we dive in though, if you're enjoying this ShadowDark journey, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and tapping the bell icon so that you don't miss what happens next. First, a little recap. 12 sessions ago, the companions started in Wardenwood. After a few adventures, the companions committed to ending this demonic scourge once and for all. They began by searching for remnants of the Green Knights, a lost order that once stood against the demons. Though they found no trace of the order, their search eventually led them to an ominous tower that stood on an island in the middle of the region's Great Lake. Upon exploring the tower, Renwick, the wizard, played by Jason, learned that the tower's past master had used its magic to tear open reality, thus allowing demons to enter into the land. Renwick is now determined to mend the rift using the tower's magic, and having secured technical manuals that explain how the tower works, Renwick plans to spend some time deciphering the manuals while the other characters engage in downtime activities. Now let's look at how I prepared for this final session. If you watched the previous video, you know that I prepped for that session by creating 2 lists. One was a timeline of things that would occur as consequences of previous player character actions, and the second was a list of steps the companions would need to complete to use the tower to shut down the rifts that allow demons to cross from the abyss into the region. Although the characters largely avoided progressing through these procedures in the last session, I was able to dust off those lists and implement them this time around. The timeline mostly concerned the fact that shattering the magic mirrors in Calcidius's laboratory inadvertently opened a new avenue for demons to enter the tower. I decided that Calcidius had created the magic mirrors by binding and stretching out mirror shades. These were demons that exist between and betwixt the abyss and the material plane. As long as the mirrors existed intact, the demons couldn't pass through. However, the shattering of the mirrors created spaces for mirror shades to seep into the world, and seep they did. The steps involved in the seepage included the following. First, audible whispers as the demons gathered. Second, the manifestation of 1d4 plus 1 mirror shades in the tower. Third, the mirror shades setting off into the tower to explore and gather information. And finally, the mirror shades attacking the companions. Meanwhile, the list of steps that the players needed to complete to use the tower effectively included 1. Finding Calcidius's notes on the workings of the tower. 2. Studying the notes. 3. Rigging the telescope to close the rifts. And 4. Using the telescope to close the rifts. As you can see, pursuing these in tandem would result in the mirror shades attacking the PCs at the very moment that the companions attempted to close the rifts. Those of you who watched the last video know that by the end of that session, the first 2 steps on both of these lists had been completed. The companions heard whispers coming from the basement level, but chose to ignore them, at least for the moment. And by the end of that session, they'd also secured Calcidius's technical manuals, which allowed Renwick to proceed with studying the notes. With that context in mind, let's see how the session unfolded. I had the players roll initiative and told them that the next few rounds would run hours in length. Renwick commandeered the tower's 4th level and settled into studying Calcidius's notes, while Rowena, played by Lauren, kept him company. Heavily damaged during the previous tower exploration, Ren, played by Dan, and Ursula, played by Mike, retired to the top level and rested, eating, sleeping, and replenishing their resources. Kraith, played by Andrew, opted to stand guard over them. Benji, played by Mario, and Githa, played by Jen, spent their time sifting through the treasure they'd uncovered earlier, organizing it into bags that they started to place in the tower's foyer. Torsen, the dwarven cleric played by Adolfo, joined them, taking a rest in the treasure room while Githa and Benji worked. Having let them act, I took my GM turn. First, I told Kraith that he sensed a presence while the others slept. Responding to this, Kraith walked over towards the telescope, and there he saw his patron, the Willow Man. This embodiment of fear knew Kraith and his companions planned to close the rifts and expressed displeasure. The Willow Man appreciated the terror that the demons brought to the land, so he charged Kraith with sabotaging his friend's plans, ensuring some imperfection would remain, allowing the demons continued access to the region. Success would bring Kraith a new boon. Failure would mean a fate worse than death. Next, I shifted my attention to Benji and Githa, asking for perception rolls. Benji failed his, but Githa succeeded. As Benji finished placing bags of platinum near the door, Githa came up the trapdoor and spotted several shadowy forms plastered against the wall, watching Benji menacingly. She warned him, and as Benji turned, brandishing his bow, one of the shadowy forms flashed a bright light, momentarily blinding him while the others moved to attack. Githa attempted to talk her way out of the situation and rolled well enough on a reaction check that the shades disappeared into the room's natural shadows and left them alone. With that, the halflings counted their blessings and continued to go about organizing their treasure. We then moved into the next round, which began the preparation phase. Renwick taught Ren and Rowena the telescope's basic operation. They all then secured the power source necessary to run the telescope. Renwick reconfigured the controls, and finally, they mounted the gem that Benji had secured earlier in Calcidius's bedchamber to the metal holder that placed it in front of the telescope's lens. Meanwhile, Benji and Githa continued to gather treasure with Torsen standing guard. For my GM turn, I had the Mirror Shades investigating the tower. Unchecked by the halflings, they encountered Calcidius, who remained imprisoned in a protection circle. When Ursula went to check on the halflings, I had her walk out of the elevator and into Calcidius's chamber just as the Mirror Shades arrived. Seeing their shadowy forms moving in the corners of the room, she decided to take the elevator back up to the library to report what she'd seen. Because she left the Mirror Shades alone with Calcidius, I rolled to determine how the interaction between Calcidius and the demons would go. Calcidius attempted to ally with them, but the reaction roll indicated hostility, which is logical given that Calcidius had bound and tormented their kind to make his mirrors. The Mirror Shades attacked Calcidius, disturbing the spell that bound him and freeing the wizard. Calcidius then cast a Fire Blast spell that destroyed all but two of the Mirror Shades, and the two surviving Mirror Shades retreated into the shadows. Calcidius, however, was now free to reclaim his tower. What followed was an unexpectedly hilarious combat. I told the players that the companions heard an explosion, and they braced themselves. Combat began when the elevator doors opened and Calcidius appeared on the 4th floor. Ursula, who was waiting with her axe poised to strike, delivered a mighty blow that dealt significant damage to the wizard, but he has a lot of hit points, so I said that he seemed to be preserved by some magical force, and then Calcidius retaliated with a death touch, dropping Ursula to 0 hit points. And the action and the comedy really began. Kraith called the elevator with Calcidius still in it to the 5th floor, but before Kraith could attack, Calcidius stupefied the warlock with a spell and descended again to the 4th floor. However, by that point, Rowena had cast invisibility on Renwick. For his part, Renwick had cast a protection circle against wizards, which sheltered himself, Rowena, and Ursula. When Calcidius tried to cast Flame Blast on them, the circle prevented his spell from happening. Rowena then hit him with an Eye Bite spell just as Benji pressed the button that brought the elevator and the wizard down to the first basement level. When the doors opened, Githa, Benji, and Torsen peppered him with arrows and crossbow bolts. Caught off balance, the wizard failed to cast Void Step using his magic wand, and Ren brought the elevator back up to the 4th floor. When the doors opened, the desperate wizard tried to hit the button to the 5th floor, failed the death check to do so, and suffered a round of attacks from the companions that killed him. And Rowena was able to stabilize Ursula, who later got to rest and recover all of her hit points. And of course, the stupefaction spell ran its course with Kraith, and he was back up in no time. This unexpectedly goofy battle provided some nice levity, and this was cool, especially in contrast to what happened next. With Calcidius defeated, the companions regrouped for the final phase of their mission. They barricaded themselves on the tower's telescope level and finalized their preparations for closing the rifts. With most of the mirror shades destroyed by Calcidius, the threat of a demonic attack had been mostly neutralized, and now everything came down to Renwick's ability to operate the telescope. This is where the consequences of previous actions really came into play. Renwick had gazed into a mirror and had been cursed to automatically fail at a major action, and this seemed the most logical moment for that curse to manifest. Renwick turned on the telescope, opened the roof, positioned the telescope properly, activated the beam to hit the focusing crystal, and then flipped the switch to close the rifts. And I just said, without a roll, you failed. They looked stunned, and I said, yeah, the curse, it manifests, and you fail. But there was still hope. Ren had given Renwick a luck token in the previous session. Normally, using a luck token allows someone to re-roll a failed action, so essentially giving them advantage on the roll. In this case, it allowed Renwick to roll at all. Jason then asked me if his preparation might have given him advantage, and I explained that a risky trip to the special collections room would have provided advantage, but without consulting the tomes there, Renwick faced a straight intelligence roll against a DC 15. With Renwick's +4 intelligence modifier, it was almost a 50-50 chance. Jason rolled, and Renwick failed. Now, I had created a 1d4 failure table in case this happened. Number 1 on that table says that the attempt opens the portals even more, ushering in legions of demons. Rolling a 2 on the table says that energies backfire, transporting the tower and the characters to an abyssal plane. Rolling a 3 says that Renwick is caught in the energies and beamed into the cosmos, effectively dying. And number 4 says that the telescope explodes, killing Renwick for sure, and possibly killing the other characters as well. So Jason rolled a 1, and that's when I realized that that's the option that I was least prepared for. While the other results were relatively clear-cut and finite, I hadn't given much thought to how this one would immediately affect the characters. And this is probably a function of me having scratched out that table moments before we began playing. What can I say? I've been really pressed for time recently. So that being the case, I initially leaned into it. I described how Renwick flipped the switch and how energy pulsed through streams across the land connecting to various rifts. I said that initially the energy seemed to start closing the rifts, but then that suddenly they shifted in intensity and started to push the rifts further apart. I described how energy backlashed into the telescope cage where Renwick was operating the machine, and then I asked how the companions would respond to this sudden backlash and buildup of energy, and this is what they said. Kraith rappelled off the tower using his rope and grappling. Ursula and Torsen both brandished their weapons and got ready to fight anything that might jump out. Benji and Githa sought cover behind the elevator casing, and Rowena attempted to catch the witch spell Oak, Ash, and Thorn, but failed. In that moment, Ren drew the wand that she had taken from Calcidius, which would allow her to cast Void Step. Casting Void Step would allow her to take herself and 4 willing targets up to 100 miles away. She approached Renwick, but Renwick, still in the cage, looked back and said, "No, not me. Take Rowena. Take the others." Ren said, "Are you sure?" And Renwick said, "Yes, definitely." Nodding, she activated the wand and teleported Rowena, Githa, Benji, and Torsen, along with herself, to the mainland shore. Arriving there, a shocked Rowena demanded to know why they had abandoned Renwick. Before Ren could answer, however, the group witnessed an explosion of orange light coming from the distant tower, and a void began to erase the sky. Ren, who's cursed with an attunement to demonic whispers, clutched her head in pain as she was overwhelmed by the psychic celebration of demon hosts gaining entry into the land. And then Jason asked, "So what happens to Renwick?" Eyes wide, I looked at the Zoom camera and said, "I don't know." Jason replied, "Is there any way we can find out?" And I said, "Probably, but right now, I just don't know. I don't have any mechanics laid out for this, and given the gravity of the situation, I'd rather not improvise. I just don't know." "Are we dead?" Jason asked. "Maybe," I said, "but I think we're gonna leave this as a cliffhanger. We'll find out later." I always read more into these situations, maybe I should, but I felt a little disappointment coming from my players. I know Jason doesn't like surprises. He's the sort that reads spoilers before going to a movie because he doesn't like not knowing what's going to happen. So I know this probably sat heavily on him. As is often the case these days, I went to bed feeling like I'd failed in some way. The session was very fun, but that ending, it just felt like I fumbled the finale. And that's what bugged me, really, that we probably only had about 15 minutes or less of playtime before the whole campaign came to an end, one way or another. At that point, I just didn't see a whole session's worth of resolution. In fact, it might only be a 5-minute conclusion, and to have that happen as an afterthought away from the table felt like a real failure. So I went to bed with these thoughts, and had kind of a fitful sleep, and then my eyes snapped wide open at 3 a.m. with a clear sense of what it meant for, quote, demon hordes to pour into the region, close quote. Renwick had failed, and demons would indeed begin to rapidly invade, but the failure was rooted in something more precise. We already knew that Renwick had been compromised by the curse that inflicted him when he gazed into the mirror, and we knew that shattering the mirror had allowed mirror shades to delve into the tower and investigate. However, when I awoke, Vidris, the Mirror Shade's demon lord, emerged fully formed from my imagination. Suddenly I knew what had happened and how it informed the new situation facing the companions. I also knew exactly what procedures we'd apply to let that situation unfold. However, now everything seemed even more inadequate. It was kind of like that episode of Seinfeld where George Costanza thinks of the perfect comeback line to a high-stakes social situation hours later when he's on his way to the airport. I don't know. I was kind of stuck on this. I didn't really know what to do, so I thought I'd leave it to my players. I went on the Signal thread that we use to communicate and told them that I was ready, and then I proposed 3 ways to handle the situation. 1, we could play by email post. 2, we could conclude the Gloaming in 15 or so minutes the following weekend, right before we played something else. Or 3, we could play via Signal over the course of the week. Our friend Dano, who is on the Signal thread but isn't playing in this particular campaign, wrote, "I, for one, would love to hear the recap and watch it play out." His comment was all that I needed to shift from thinking of the Signal option as the least of 3 bad possibilities to a really exciting experiment. Thinking, inaccurately as it turned out, that the players wouldn't be able to access our Foundry campaign over the course of the week, I created 2 things. One was a PDF document displaying screen caps of all the player character sheets, and the second was a link to a Roll20 page that I created for die rolling purposes. After sending links to these resources, I punched up a brief summary of the situation on Signal, and we began our Play on Signal experience. Next episode, I'll share how this unconventional format led to one of the most dramatic and satisfying campaign conclusions I've experienced in a long time. If you're excited about the conclusion and enjoy my content in general, please consider subscribing, liking, and tapping the bell icon. In the meantime, I thank you all for tuning in. I thank you for sticking around to the end if you did. And as always, I wish you good health. I wish you good cheer. I wish you good gaming. Goodbye.